Hey everybody, Pat Armstrong here with the latest edition of Increase, the lifestyle vlog for men and the women who love them. Now I don't know, many of you may have been like me. When I was a boy, something I enjoyed doing was putting together models. It didn't really matter what it was, whether a car or a plane or whatever. It was just fascinating to complete the process of gluing together all the little pieces to form an object. It was also fascinating to open the box for the first time and see all the assorted pieces still in the plastic bag. But then you begin to look for it. The most important item in the box, the one item that held the key to success or failure of your model kit, and that was the instructions. I remember having a friend as a boy that bragged about being able to complete his models without following the instructions. I also remember seeing some of the completed projects that resembled the item it was supposed to be. And one thing I also never quite understood was why he had so many pieces left over when the project was done. Now, we men, we still have our projects today. The thing is, now they are usually bigger and sometimes not even for us. But we are entrusted by others to put together pieces of furniture that come in a box from stores like IKEA. And we go through the same anticipation as we did as kids as we open the box and see all the pieces that need to be put together, and then we look for it. Where are the instructions that will help us successfully complete the project at hand? Now sometimes, depending on the project, the instructions can be simple, while at other times the instructions can be more complex. And you know, we have an instruction book that can help us with this project called life, and it's called the Bible. In fact, many people like to use the acronym BIBLE to mean Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. Now, many people see the Bible as a religious book, and they fail to gain the practical instructions that are available to all of us. So today I want to look at one such person, and even though he claimed to follow the religious points of the Bible, he failed to follow some of the practical points. Therefore, his life didn't quite turn out the way he had hoped. We're going to pick up the story all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the last book of Moses and a reminder and summation of the law to Israel before Moses dies and they go into the Promised Land. This isn't a new law, but a final explanation of how things are to be once the nation is established. One of the passages in Deuteronomy that has always fascinated me is found in chapter 17. It begins in verse 14, where God gives the instructions on how Israel should set up a monarchy. Now this is actually prophetic because up to this point Israel had been a theocracy where God was in charge. But he knew the day would come that Israel would want to be like everyone else and want a king. So, even hundreds of years before this idea crosses anyone's mind, God gives instructions for a king. Follow along as I read. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren, who shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites, And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So, we see there are some specific instructions not only for Israel and how they select their king, but also for the king himself. The king must not accumulate horses, especially none from Egypt. Horses were a sign of power, and God wanted Israel to trust in his strength and not their own. And Egypt was known for having strong horses, but God did not want Israel to ever go back that way again, so they would never forget who led them out of bondage. The second thing the king was not to do was to accumulate wives. The responsibility of the kingdom was going to be huge, and the king would have to balance his responsibility at work with those at home. And too much responsibility at home would turn his heart away from important things like the kingdom, and more importantly, his relationship with God. The third thing the king was not to do was accumulate riches to the point that he would no longer depend on God to sustain him. And the last and most important thing the king was supposed to do was keep a copy of the instructions with him at all times, so he wouldn't, number one, forget God. He would, number two, know the laws by which to rule the people. That he would, number three, remain humble and not become proud. And that he himself would, number four, follow the instructions. The Lord told him if he would do these things, he would have a long reign and that his children would succeed him. Now, let's fast forward a few hundred years to a man by the name of Samuel, who was approached by the people of Israel in 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 and 5. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Does that sound familiar? Just like God told Moses hundreds of years before, here are the people coming to Samuel asking for a king. Now, we know the first king was a man by the name of Saul. And if you haven't already done so, I want to encourage you to watch this video on King Saul. But unfortunately, Saul's kingdom was cut short, and his son never got to sit on the throne because Saul couldn't follow the instructions. Once Saul was removed from the throne, God set up a man by the name of David, on which I did a whole series of videos. And David was not a perfect man, but David did follow the instructions, and even if he did make a mistake, he fixed it. In fact, this is what the Bible had to say about David in 1 Kings 15, verses 4 and 5. "Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by setting up his son after him and by establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite." Because David followed the instructions, he had a long reign of 40 years, and his son Solomon sat on the throne after him. When Solomon first began to reign, things looked really good. David had a very successful reign and passed on the kingly instructions to Solomon, which the Bible says he followed as well. In fact, things were so good that God came to him and asked him whatever he wanted, he would give it to him. At this point, Solomon was very humble and answered the Lord like this in 1 Kings 3, 7 through 9. "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? So what Solomon asked for really pleased the Lord. And the Lord told him, because he didn't ask for riches or long life or the death of his enemies, but asked for wisdom to rule his people, God was going to bless him with all of it. And history shows us the glory days of Israel was under the reign of King Solomon. But God reminded him in 1 Kings 9, verses 4 through 8, Now if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, You shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons at all turn from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have consecrated in my name I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all peoples, and as far as this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, What has the Lord done to the land and to this house? But unfortunately, over time, Solomon forgot to follow the instructions. Listen to how Solomon changed over the years in 1 Kings 10:26 through chapter 11 and verse 4. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. And Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and Kiva. The king's merchants bought them in Kiva at the current price. Now a chariot that was imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver, and a horse 150. And thus, through their agents, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart, for it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So we see here, not only did Solomon not follow the instructions, but he went directly against them. He accumulated horses and got them from, of all places, Egypt. He accumulated riches. He was so rich that they said silver was like street pavement. And he accumulated wives, 1,000 to be exact, who turned his heart away from God. The very things that God told Moses to put into the instructions, Solomon totally ignored. And because of it, he lost his kingdom. Not only did he lose his kingdom, but God divided it. Only for the sake of David did God allow his family to continue to reign over 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And you know, it happens to everybody at one time or another. For whatever reason, we feel like we can handle it without the instructions. We get comfortable and sure of ourselves and forget to remember the basics. You know, the only difference between David and Solomon was that when David forgot the instructions, he went back to the basics and picked up where he got off track. Unfortunately, Solomon continued down that wrong path until the day he died, and his kingdom suffered for it. Instructions are given for a reason. Instructions are given so that whatever it is we are working on can be completed to be used for its intended purpose. Hopefully, as we follow the instructions for life passed on to us through the Bible, we can pass those instructions on to the next generation so they can live their lives full of purpose.